First of all, a couple of books are on this table. They're books that I have written. One is A Grace-Filled Journey Home. It's a series of questions that I want to ask myself as I get older. And at the last congregation I worked at, there were 2 people in the office, and we were talking one day, and all 3 of us were caregivers of somebody. And all 3 of us said, we don't want to be as stubborn as the people we were caregiving. And I said to myself, I think I even said out loud, I need to write that down so I remember that. So I began writing letters to myself about what I want to remember as I get older. And that's what this is all about. And part of it also then, there was a tremendous hiatus in terms of writing while my wife died. And then I picked it up again. So the last part of it really reflects some of the things that was about. This one, which there's a few more of, is a book on belonging, 31 Days to Ponder Christian Community. I didn't have it proofread, and Nancy will identify the fact that I'm not a good speller. And I also had it, I had it printed in the cheapest way possible. And the pictures, every one of the days have a picture either for myself or my son, and they're not that good. They didn't come out that good on the paper that was printed on. So, but it's available, and take them for free, I mean, they're there. Let's pray. Gracious God, work within our hearts that we might know your comfort in those times of loss and grief, that we might know it and experience it in such a way that we can also share it with others later on. Give us hearts and minds that are open to hear what you might have to say to us this day. In your name, amen. So, what comes to your mind when I say the word grief? What's 1 or 2 words that come to your mind when I say the word grief?
Loss.
Loss?
Yeah.
Anything else?
Sadness.
Sadness?
Depression.
Depression?
Emptiness.
Emptiness?
Anger.
Anger?
My brother.
My brother? So the question is, what 1 or 2 words come to your mind when you hear the word grief? We've had a number of them so far.
Loneliness.
Loneliness?
Confusion.
Confusion?
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty?
Loss.
Loss? So those are some of the words that come to our mind. Now I'll hand this out. That is. You can take one. I ended up adding to that list, and there's some quotes in there also. I ended up with 26 words that came to my mind. Some of them were longer than 1 word. But let's ask a different question here. Whether from your experience or whether from what you think people experience, what are some things that people might feel or experience during times of grief or loss? And this is, I guess, where I came up with 26. I shouldn't have left that out. So don't even look at that yet. What are some emotions or experiences? And we've already said some. You've identified a number of those when you came up with one word, and most of them were one word. What are some other things people?
Unusual for me, but food lost its flavor.
Food lost its flavor. Okay,
Disorienting.
disoriented.
What am I gonna do?
Yeah, what am I gonna do?
And kind of similar to the food losing its flavor, music loses its potency.
Music loses its potency. Interesting. Some things that I didn't know. Go ahead.
A few of my friends whose husbands passed on, they were unable to comprehend while they read for years.
So that confusion of mind, the disorientation of mind is there. Very, very true.
It's almost like the mind is already saturated
Mhm.
because of the event that took place.
I slipped and I looked at the list,
Yeah.
but there's two that come in tandem, and that is anger and guilt.
Anger and guilt.
Angry at the person, and then a sense of profound guilt because I'm angry.
Mm.
It's like I have no reason to be. I'm not the one suffering.
Sometimes we're angry with God.
Okay, sometimes angry with God. Is it okay to be angry with God? Is it? Read the Psalms. Very often.
Lack of acceptance. I had trouble accepting
Lack
what
of
was happening.
Mhm. Yeah. Lack of acceptance.
A lot of the kids I speak with are afraid. There's a lot of fear. Who's gonna die next?
Yes, a lot of fear,
Loss of self-esteem.
loss of self-esteem. Can you say a little bit more of that? What do you mean by loss of self-esteem?
Right.
Especially in related to loss.
When experiencing a loss, sometimes we find that and also because of the confusion that oftentimes goes with that, we lose track of who we are.
Okay, so loss of self-esteem and loss of even a sense of one's own identity and who they are. Yes.
Yeah, not knowing exactly what he's supposed to do. What am I
Wow.
supposed to do?
Yeah. What do I do next? What do I do now? Mhm.
Regret that you didn't.
The regret, yeah. I could have added more than, I had 26 now, I could have added a lot more than 26, but some of the things you said. Look at what I've had here: shock, denial, anger, getting angry with God, guilt, bargaining, tears at unexpected times. I had a professor at seminary, Dr. Lee Griffin, a psychiatrist. And he had a child, very, very young, an infant, die, and I'm not even sure how. 20 years later, he was going down the freeway and he had to pull over. He was crying so hard. 20 years later. Despair, depression, feelings I'm crazy, what's wrong with me? Loneliness, disorientation, confusion, forgetfulness, lack of concentration, time distortion, feeling as if the loss of a loved one didn't really even happen. Something. I remember how many times I think she's coming in the door, obsessive review or rumination, suicidal thoughts, jumping into relationships, especially for men. I went to a grief group And a number of those men, just weeks after, were getting into a relationship already. That's not what to do. Temporary self-focus, hopefully temporary. A needing to tell or retell stories, remembering and sharing stories, loss of ability to experience pleasure, feeling as though you have to take care of others who seem uncomfortable around you and therefore not talking about what really is important. Sudden mood changes, not eating or eating too much, not exercising, sitting in front of the TV, staring at nothing, not able to go to a restaurant. That was one I put down. As single, after the death of my wife, 40 years, I couldn't go to a restaurant to eat alone. I could go to a fast food place, that's different. But a restaurant, I did not feel comfortable doing that at all. Now, I've talked to some who that didn't bother them at all. Others totally agree with me. They couldn't do that. Feeling of lack of control, whereas we might have that unconscious sense of kind of being in control of our lives and situations, and then all of a sudden, and then adjustment and acceptance. Anyone want to share any of your, if you've gone through a loss, you want to share around one of those kinds of experiences, not all of them. Is there any experience or feeling that you would want to share?
Well,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
A third grader died out of forks suddenly and tragically. And I had seen that child earlier in the day of his death, and he died. And I was oddly numb, you know, like just kind of in functional mode. And then much later, I had a big emotional experience. And that happened also when my grandmother died when I was about 12. And I didn't cry until I visited her gravesite when I was about 55. But sometimes I feel like that's weird about me. It's just how it is.
A little bit more about that.
And one,
Yeah, go for it, John.
I stirring nothing ever since my dad died. I find myself zoning in and out of reality.
Mhm. Kind of going in and out of reality.
Yeah. It's weird.
When my father died, there were a few things I didn't know about
Mhm. Mhm.
because he had served in World War II and Korean.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until after he passed that because I was executor of the estate, I had to go through all these papers and books and stuff, and many of which had things written in them about him and about his accomplishments.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I found myself confabulating.
What does that mean?
Confabulating is something that alcoholics do too. They exaggerate a story.
Okay.
And so in my mind, I found myself confabulating some of the things that he had done.
Okay.
And as time went by, it was my realization that, because while he was around, hardly ever had much time with him. And so I guess I was trying to create more time with my father that I couldn't get any other way.
Thank you. think, especially those who have gone through some type of grief or loss, how long do you think it took for you to become a little more resilient to life? What kind of time frame was there in that grieving process?
Six months.
6 months, okay?
Got that unexpectedly, so. Yeah, so we had to go through his estate so it took months just to get through all of those things.
Uh-huh.
And then it still took several weeks after we closed all of that. It was like run autopilot
Yeah.
and you're doing what you need to do. And then you get to finally read. Took many months.
The loss of my parents was a little easier to take. And it's strange, but it's almost like they were in their 80s. We kind of knew when one of them started to go downhill what to expect. We kind of knew when the other one went downhill and what to expect. And they had taken care of things. They had a will. And so those things, it almost, for lack of a better word, you know, and again, this dovetails into the guilt thing, but it almost made sense. And so those were easier to get over. It doesn't, you know, and you still miss them, but you get to a point where it's like, okay, I can live with this. I still struggle over my brother because it didn't make sense.
How long ago was that?
He fell ill about 5 years ago to the day almost, and he passed away in July, on July 8th of 2018. He was too young, and the way he went was too tragic. It was, he had an episode. He almost died in his car. They found him in his car, passed out, kidney failure. It was alcoholism. And then in the violent DTs, I don't think the doctors knew what he was suffering from, but in the violent DTs and the lack of nicotine, he suffered a stroke, and the stroke specialist wasn't present,
Mhm.
and it ended up taking everything but his ability to move his eyes. And so he was warehoused for the last month and a half, and I could go visit him, and we could communicate through the blinking of his eyes. And I can't make sense of it still. It is what it is.
I think it makes a big difference how old the person is. I mean, this was a
Yeah.
younger,
No, he was immediately older. I was the youngest.
well, I'm thinking of my one set of grandparents that lived into their 90s.
Yeah.
And when they passed, you know, everyone was ready to accept it, I think,
Yeah.
and knew it was coming, and just felt like, oh, they had a great life, and their memorial service and gathering was almost more like a family reunion
Mhm.
than it was for a memorial. But
Yeah.
younger people, that's different, and probably the younger they are, the more difficult it is.
I did a funeral of a young man, early 20s. And I bet there were 500 people at that funeral. It couldn't have been in the church. We had to do it in a big hall. It was huge, and that's part of the reason. The issue of how long is an important kind of issue, how long grief goes on. For a while, it was thought that grief might last for a couple of months and you should be able to get going after that. That isn't very helpful. One of the books that was given to me by a very, very good friend and mentor and brother when my wife died, was grieving mindfully. And mindfulness is basically, I think, a Hindu process. And this is definitely in that order. But it became very important for me. And he says, the author of this, Samit, I think it's a he. A more realistic amount of time to which one may begin resilience. Sometime after my wife died, I took a course or a program to become a spiritual director. And one of the books that we read was Broken Hallelujahs. This also became a really important piece for me. She says, we inherently know how to grieve, but society tells us to do it faster. Grief work is culturally inappropriate. How does grief work? How does our culture tell us to speed up? How does our culture say that grief work is inappropriate?
You're expected to do things that you wouldn't want to otherwise do.
Okay. Mhm.
Well, different cultures have different grief practices.
Yeah.
And there's some European cultures that I don't know which I've heard that, like traditionally the widow was dressed in black for a year and,
Yeah.
that. And then there was one more indigenous culture here in the Americas, and I don't remember which one this was, but they had something like, it was a very short period of time after the body was buried. I don't know if it was a week or a month, but that was it. And then there was anticipation to move on. So it's not just our culture that doesn't accept.
Yeah.
There's traditional cultures that have just said, no, this is it, and then you.
Mhm.
Yeah, our culture, mainstream culture, doesn't really go much for huge emotive expressions of grief.
No.
No.
And it usually is punctuated by, there's something wrong with you, you need to go see a counselor,
Mhm.
as opposed to what you're doing is appropriate under the circumstances. It's ironic though, I was up late last night watching Dances with Wolves and the chief comes up to Stands with Fists and says, stands with fists. Today you are done grieving.
Yes,
It's like you were ordered. I mean, they talk about cultural norm, it's like you grieve as long as the chief tells you to.
Mhm. Mhm.
But that's kind of, in a way, that's us too, right?
Yeah. When I ask you about one word that typifies grief, nobody said the word avoidance. And we would never probably acknowledge that fact. That avoidance is one of the things we deal with. Death we avoid, but we also avoid dealing with grief.
Are you talking about the griever or the friends of the griever?
I think our culture avoids grieving.
Yeah, because like with Ross, I like to talk about his ex-wife with fair frequency, but I find a lot of people around him, nobody does talk
Mhm.
about Margaret, so it's like, there is an avoidance.
Yes.
Well, Stan, like I mentioned to you before, I've tried to offer something like this before in the way of a class. Got shut down. Just, nobody wants to talk about that.
Mhm.
Yeah, Marty, when she had helped John get into a skilled nursing facility because she knew that things were going different for him. and he needed more care. And she said, and she would just break down and cry and say, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just miss him so much. And I know he's on his way to heaven. And I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't function today. I said, there's nothing wrong with you. That's totally normal.
Mhm.
It's totally acceptable. This is a crummy situation. It's okay to cry about it.
So feeling as if something is wrong with you.
Yeah.
Which is kind of one of the things we end up feeling. 1974, a long time ago, Ernest Becker wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Denial of Death. I have always remembered that book. How does our culture, first of all, deny, no, let me put it this way. What are some of the, what is a euphemism? What's a euphemism?
Pass away.
Oh, well, that's an
When you call
example.
Something what it's not.
Yeah, we come up with a less emotional or less significant word for another, something else. So what's a euphemism for death that we use? Passing away,
Just passed.
he just passed. What are some other ones? Kick the bucket.
Sarcastic perhaps.
Pardon?
Marty called it heavenly discharge.
Heavenly discharge. The gun to heaven. The with the angels.
Got their wings, angel wings.
Yeah. angel wing.
God needed another gardener or fisherman or a hunter
A
or
reaper.
a weed puller.
Pushing up daisies.
Yeah. So we come up with these words for death. What does that say about grieving? When we come up, here's another thing that's one of the things that has happened, well, I don't know how long it's been, the last 10 years maybe, that I can remember anyway. Funerals now are not necessarily funerals.
Celebration of life.
They're celebrations of life. What does that say about grieving?
Well, it feels like we're pushing away the finality of the loss.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
It's an attempt to redefine death,
To make it what?
something more pleasant.
Yeah, something not
More
quite
tolerable.
as past.
We'll have a memorial picnic in July.
Yes, yes. I served in 4 different congregations, 3 of those being farming communities. In one of those farming communities, a family that I knew very well and really got along with very well. They had 2, at that time, they had 2 girls who were in grade school. And they had a little kitten. That kitten was killed by a car on the road right in front of their house. And the parents saw it or something or other, knew it right away. They went immediately and scooped up that kitten. I don't know how they disposed it, I don't know, but they did. And immediately went out and got another kitten before their daughters came home from school. What does that teach?
Kittens are awfully available.
Kittens are available. Yes, it does teach that.
I think it fails, it's what it fails to teach is kind of the skill of processing the inevitable that we all have to face.
Yeah. It really, it doesn't allow a person to learn how to grieve.
But you know,
And a
there's a,
child can learn.
it's almost, the situation though is almost understandable because how do you help a friend who's going through grief? Talk it away, you can't sugarcoat it, put icing on it.
We're gonna talk about that.
I had a friend who there was a girl who just crushed my soul in high school. And he told me, and he was my best friend at the time, and he says, this is just one of those situations that suck. There's nothing, you can't avoid feeling bad. And it was, there's those little bits and pieces in life that make perfect sense. And that was one of the most meaningful things that someone ever told me, was that, yeah, there are some situations that just stink. Sorry, I won't use the other word. And that's the way it is. So you're left with the raw emotion, the pain. How do you make sense of it?
Yeah. Again, from broken alleluias. Losses are really close. We grieve what we need to grieve when we are ready, not what we think we are supposed to grieve or what others think we should grieve. We've said that a lot of different ways this morning. The timing of grief is such that who knows? Whether it might be 20 years down the road, and Dr. Lee Griffin is crying his heart out. I call it kind of recycled grief. That periodically something will trigger. And we simply reset. It doesn't mean we haven't gone on in life. It doesn't mean we haven't accepted the grief. It simply means we're recycling a different part of the grief. And we're learning to grow.
I was thinking about Vicky's comment about, how long afterwards she cried. Well, I didn't cry at either of my parents' funerals or at their passing or anything like that. But I go to somebody's funeral service that I barely know, and that's where I weep.
Yeah, who knows? Let me ask a true false question. So this is true and false. If I say to a person, I understand what you're going through. They have just lost a loved one. I've gone through it also when my wife of over 40 years died of cancer. True or false?
Oh, yeah. No, well, it's like when, you visit somebody and they're going for surgery, quote unquote, minor surgery. Well, might not be minor to them, and so I think, I really like, that response from your friend. I mean, that just, that's something, it's just naming something for what it is. And you have to be, I find pastorally to be very careful about saying, I understand, because I understand the concept of loss, but not your loss and your relationship. And, and I might equate it with like, a loss that I've experienced. Well, that might've been a loving, peaceful kind of loss, and their loss might have opened up a whole can of worms that's, ugly and, so, yeah.
Well, both, I agree that both are true, and but two things can be true at the same time, and we have common experience and in a broader heading. But each situation is its own silo, emotionally speaking.
The word that's the problem here is I understand what you're going through.
We can have a general understanding.
Yeah, it can be very general.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with that feeling.
Pardon?
I'm familiar with that feeling.
I'm familiar with the feeling. Or I think when we go through loss, maybe we have a greater sense of compassion and empathy with a person who is also going through loss. But what are some of the reasons why we might not understand? And you've identified them.
Yeah, well, and one thing, there's also something that's going on inside of us. I'm flashing back to a piece I heard on the radio one time, a story about how people who have, like this was related like job loss, and that studies found that people who had gone through a job loss were not necessarily good counseling for people that were going through it, because they just as soon not want to relive those feelings and things like that, you know, and so there, yeah. So you've got kind of that going on in the middle of it, as opposed to, then you're working out your own feelings of like, you know, in the process of, as opposed to just being open to say, what is that like? Or, you know, how are you doing with that? You know, sort of thing, I guess. But
There are a lot of variables within a job loss, because it kind of depends on what kind of a job was it to that person. Is this a temporary job, or is this something they felt was a life calling, or what? And so that's just even one degree of what you're talking about.
well, I'm not even sure I understand, like, when we talk about our own losses, I mean, you know, do we really fully understand our own? I mean, I think we're always going through some new nuance, like you're saying, recycling grief or whatever. We come to live with it probably and adapt, but
Jenny Kezik, if I'm pronouncing it right, Franciscan Hospice Bereavement Services. She said, no two people will ever grieve the same way, with the same intensity, or for the same duration. Only when we understand this can we accept our own manner of grieving and be sensitive to another's response to loss. Some reasons why we might not understand exactly what's going on in another person who's experienced loss. One, past life experience might be totally different. The relationship with the deceased might be totally different than the relationship we've had with them. So both of my parents died when I was in my early 20s. My mother, for whom I was very close to, was a shock. It was hard. It was a grieving process. 2 years later, my father died. My father, who I grew up with, as the primary emotion was fear in that relationship. It was only until the last few years of his life that we became closer. So it was totally a different experience with that. The circumstances surrounding the death are different. You know, I have been with families where a loved one, it's a terrible, terrible experience of death. I mean, they have fought death and they have struggled, and it's a very painful death. And it's really, really difficult. I have been with families for whom that death was just the opposite. Like perhaps your grandparents or others too. Then the influences of the present can be different. So there's all kinds of different things that we have experienced and that the other person has experienced. So to say, I understand what you're going through is not quite, I would say it's false. But it doesn't mean we can't be there with you. In fact, again, from Brooke, she says that every person traveling through grief needs a traveling companion during that grieving process. Quote, a traveling companion is someone willing to sit in the darkness with us, right in the middle of those excruciating, unanswerable whys. You have it. Those who have gone through a grieving process, have you had a traveling companion with you in that process? There was.
I think I'd like to add one thing too. It's not only that we need to be careful about how come alongside a person that's grieving. Because I'm reason I'm going to say what I'm going to say is because I've had occasions to grieve.
Mhm.
Every. And so as far as my grief and accepting being in that state, I have to accept the fact that it's going to be different.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it is definitely going to be different each time, every time.
And I've learned something different with each one as well.
Mhm.
And I've come to the point where I look forward to that part of it.
Mhm. Dr. Doug Anderson was head of Presbyterian Counseling Services in Seattle, a Lutheran pastor. He was also head of a marriage and family therapy program that I was a part of. So he started off as a professor. Then much later, when I went to Grace Lutheran Church in Des Moines, Washington, my last congregation I served, so I was much older. He was a member of that congregation. And he became a mentor of mine. And then he became a brother of mine. And during that grieving process, he was my traveling companion. And definitely was a brother. The question, so those who have gone through grief, what have you wanted from other people as you were going through grief? What is it that you wanted them to say or do or be as you were going through it? And think about it this way. Think about it in the days and the immediate weeks following the death. 6 months down the road, a year down the road, and we could go further. But are there different things that you needed in this and wanted? What did you want somebody to say to you?
I think initially I just wanted to be recognized, but allowed to be left alone.
You wanted to be left alone. Mhm.
I wanted to hear stories of my parents,
Yeah,
put together all the pieces, just like you did.
yeah. Wanted to hear stories of the loved ones, your parents. I had after Diane died, my sons and she was cremated, and we were able to spread ashes in 2 different places. One of those was in on the Gallatin River in Montana. The extended family had a cabin. But my sons wanted to go into Yellowstone, which was right there, right next to Gallatin, and do some camping afterward. And I really did not want to go. I wanted that time alone. And one of the secretaries, administrators in the office, I said that to her, and she looked at me, very quiet, didn't say a whole lot of things. She looked at me and said, Stan, you're going to have plenty of time to be alone. You need to go. And it's exactly what I needed to hear. It is what I needed. Somebody,
So there's a difference between what you feel you want
yes,
and what's actually good for you.
Yeah, what I felt I wanted was not necessarily
Right.
always good for me. Maybe if I had done that, then time alone, maybe that would have been okay. But that isn't what I need. I needed to be with my family.
Besides the
Some-
fact that they needed you to be there.
They needed. Someone has said, for some people, the death of a loved one is a time when one feels the loss. No, that's not what I want to say. Where did it go? Okay, here it is. This is again from Broken Hallelujah. During Mark's death, her brother, during Mark's illness and death, statements and gentle directives were more helpful than open-ended questions. And I can understand that because of that confusion within one's mind. And maybe that's part, and even as I said, the secretary of the church said you need to go. It was also said very much in love. And she was, so sometimes we need somebody telling us things that we need to do. Anyone else though about what you might have wanted or needed during time of death? During time of grieving?
Maybe just affirmation that, you are grieving instead of, oh, how you doing, you're supposed to say, I'm doing fine.
Yeah. We're gonna come back to that one, yes.
Just acceptance that you are grieving.
Yeah, the acceptance of where we're at.
I remember when my grandma died when I was 12, my dad said, whatever feelings you're having are okay.
Mm,
That was helpful.
yeah. One of the things I needed, and I needed for some time, was to talk about Diane. I needed to tell some of the stories that some people didn't know.
Did you want someone to prompt you to tell a story? Or did you just want to tell it in your own time when you wanted to?
Yeah, this is what's interesting. So the question of the difference between somebody who says, how are you doing? When you know that all they want is, I'm doing okay. And somebody who says, how are you doing? And you know that they're not going to accept, I'm okay. They didn't necessarily have to prompt me, but I had to know within myself that they wanted to listen to me. And that's a big difference. There was a guy, the lead pastor of the last church I served, had been a friend for 40 years, more than that. He was also a person who would control conversations. He dominated conversations. So it was very hard to get in a word edgewise. But when he came into my office and said, how are you doing? I knew that he wanted to listen. There was something about, one, he would come in, close the door and sit down and say, how are you doing? He wanted to, and he was extremely good at that.
A couple years ago, I heard of the death of somebody who I'd been very close to in college, so it'd been decades and decades. But I had to talk. I had to find connections and to find those people that knew
Mhm.
the same friend. reached out across the country just for us to have those conversations. And I've really needed that
Mhm.
process.
Mhm. And I think some of us are verbally processors. Others of us are much more silent processors. And we need that time alone. Everybody's different.
One of the difficult times is when you've been processing through your grief. You come to that point where you feel like you want to step back into your life as you knew it. And trying to do that isn't easy. Depending on, how you've been going along. It's not always easy to do that if you're not really invited to do that. So to have that person that we've been talking about that's walking through this with you, if you don't have that just makes that transition 10 times harder.
We are a society, well, churches especially, are societies, communities that are family and couple oriented. Sometimes it's really, really hard for people who have suffered some type of loss of a significant person to come back into a church because it's just uncomfortable. I know the last congregation I served, there was this large group of people who had been together for probably 20 plus years. And they had a group called empty nesters. But when somebody died from that group, it was really hard for them to come back in because they were all couples. How do we handle that? We need these people who walk beside us.
Yeah, my parents were part of a cards group where couples, a bunch of couples got together and they played cards. And so, when somebody's not there, it throws a number on
Mhm.
the game. But they became really close friends because they would meet every week, just like Sunday school would be for us. And it turned out to be a really great support group because
And sometimes it can.
because when Grandpa went back, he found out that somebody else was losing their life. And he's like, I'll walk you through this. And so sometimes it's good for you to go back because you have a special skills.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a negative experience.
I had a pretty odd negative experience when my mother died in the church. I was not there. My brother was. She died in Seattle. And the only thing I could think about was, where is she? My mother, I did not know if she was a Christian or not. There were some indications that she wasn't. And all I could think about and cry and cry and cry is, where is she? Is she in hell or is she in heaven? And it was a devastating time, an unusual kind of grief, I guess. And my pastor did not come to see me. I eventually ran into him 2 or 3 weeks later at an event. And he made some comment about my mother's death. And he said, why don't we go have a coffee and we'll talk about it. So I immediately began crying a lot, and I said, I don't know where she is. I don't know. And he said, what do you mean? I don't know if she's with God or if she's with the devil. And he said, well, then you need to ask for forgiveness. And I said, forgiveness for what? And he said, well, if you don't know, I'm certainly not gonna tell you. To this day, I still don't know. I went to him and agreed to coffee, hopefully to get some support, because I had not shared that with anybody. Wasn't until probably 2 years later that my brother told me that when Mom died, that she was very quiet and very calm, and that was a clue for me because she was very hyper, very anxious person. And when my brother said that she was very quiet, that gave me a clue that maybe she was with God after all. But that process went on for me for 2 or 3 years. And certainly the church was absolutely no help. No one in the church said a word to me about my mother's death. So the church isn't always as helpful as they would like to be. Fortunately, it wasn't First Presbyterian for you.
Can't imagine ever saying anything like
I
that.
know, it was-
Gee.
To this day, I asked for forgiveness, but I didn't know what I was asking for.
You know, I was in Endicott, and little Endicott is 325 people. No stores. And a guy on the street said, Stan, do you want to go out for ice cream? Sure, not thinking about, that meant we had to go to Colfax, 20 miles away for ice cream. And we did. And this guy was in his 80s. And he began to tell me his life story. And he had at least one, I don't know if there were a couple of infants who died before baptism. This is a Lutheran church. And the pastor said that they were going to hell because they had not been baptized. And he lived with that all his life. But there's more than one church that has missed the mark. So we'll have it was a joy to be with you during that. Believe that. I guess one final comment. Being with people. Sooner or later, we're always going to be with somebody who's breathing. You don't have to fix them. You don't have to fix them. You don't have to take away the grief. But you can't anyway. But you can be with them and listen. Yes. And listening is one of the hardest things we have to do. I have not met a whole lot of good listeners. But that's what we need at that point, at least for a period of time. We need somebody to listen to us. So comment about 2 books that I mentioned, some come in. 2 books that I have written that are available for you. Go ahead and just take. They're free. This Grace, a Grace Still Journey Home, you can buy on Amazon, but that's free. You're Let's pray. You wanna pray?
Sure. Lord God, we thank you for this conversation and for Stan's guidance. The conversation today has, I think many of us brought up our own feelings of loss. And as we remember them, the people and the circumstances surrounding that emptiness. May we find grace in knowing that you are with us. Take heart in the healing that we have accomplished. Trust into you, the remaining clouds that are still there. Help us to be patient with ourselves as you are patient with us. To heal, to walk with us, to restore us. Pray in Jesus' name.
An author named Walter Brueggemann talks about the Psalms, and he calls them the Psalms of disorientation. Important things to, many of them are important to read and to pray through.
Thanks, Dan.